For those of you who don't understand the concept of a Mount Rushmore, it comes from the mountain that the Americans have carved 4 of their presidents' faces into. The premise being that these are 4 of their greatest presidents, some of their greatest leaders. When we talk about it in sports, we're talking about the 4 greatest individuals within a space, within a game, within a sport to ever do it. 2 of the most common examples, I think, would be football. So the 4 players typically you'd find up there would be Pele, Maradona, Messi, Ronaldo, and then, it's all individual, really. But those are probably the most common you'll find. The NBA, you usually find things like Jordan, LeBron, Kobe, Kareem, Wilt. Depends on the person, again. It's a very individual criteria. And that's okay. It's okay to have differences in this sort of list, as long as you explain why you hold certain players to this higher standard than everyone else. My personal criteria for individual greatness is, firstly, performance. So stats, what the eye test shows in terms of their performance as an individual. That matters, because you can't be the 5th best player on a team that wins everything and be considered as great as the first player, best player. Next thing is achievements. You're not an all-time great if you're not winning. Sorry, but finishing second a bunch won't cut it. It's better than finishing 4th. It counts for more than that, but really what matters at the end of the day is what you've actually achieved. The third and most esoteric of the criteria I consider would be cultural impact and legacy. So this is one of the big deciding factors when it comes to 2 players who've had really close careers in terms of how great they are. The example I like to use is in basketball, Kobe Bryant versus Tim Duncan. As an individual, Tim Duncan might actually be the greater player. He dominated on both sides of the ball for well over a decade, won 5 rings, won 3 finals MVPs, I believe, which is 1 more than Kobe. Yet Kobe, culturally, has had a much larger impact on the world. No one shouts Duncan when they're throwing a balled up piece of paper into a bin. No one says that. They should, especially if they're looking to do a bounce shot, because Duncan off the glass, money. But they don't. Everyone shouts Kobe. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about cultural impact and legacy. So I'm going to start with the locks. The guys who are 100%. First, device. For me, in global offensive, there are few that compare. He has truly been consistently one of the best players in the world. Has won a plethora of tournaments. I mean, there's almost a tournament he hasn't won, at least twice. At this point, he's won 4 majors, he's won everything. And he has 15 MVP medals to go along with it, which is insane. Next, simple. Individually, no one compares. Ziwu is the only one who's ever had a single year that compares to the simple, but I would argue simple's been playing at this level since 2016. He has been untouchable in terms of being the most skilled player in the world, and for me it's not close. Over that period of time, no one has come close. He hasn't had the achievements of a device, for example, but that's really not through any fault of his own. We've seen him win MVPs from 2nd place. We've seen him completely take over games and still lose because he's not had the right teams around him. And whilst it does count against him, there's still no doubt that he is one of the greatest in global offensive. Now third, I think this one is the most contentious of my top 3, but I have Cold Zero. Now, I'm not just pandering to the Brazilian crowd, vocal as they are. It's more of a reflection I've had when I've looked at Cold Zero's career in terms of the tournaments he's won, the style in which he's won them, and the cultural legacy he's left. Because, sure, everyone has highlights, but I know as someone who was still relatively new to watching Counter-Strike, I was only been watching Counter-Strike just over a year when I watched Cold Zero hit the jumping double from Cold. That was such a massive turning point, I think, in terms of not necessarily the popularity of Counter-Strike, but how it sucked so many people into the highlights, the special moments that we can produce in this game, and that is one of the all-time great moments. He has left his mark and has the stats and the achievements to back it up. So now we come on to the maybes. Some of you who are old heads, who've been watching the game since, probably watching in 1.6, maybe Source, you might recognise that I've not put any of the Swedish players up on this list. So, why are there no Swedes in my top 3? Well, there's a bunch competing for the 4th spot, I'll tell you that much. Of Olaf Meister with his absolutely insane performances in 2015, where he became the #1 player in the world. He won 2 majors with Fnatic, and he has been a bit disappointing since, obviously, because he's aged. His prime didn't come during what I'd call the prime of CSGO, which has been really, in terms of the level of competition, has really come since 2017, 2018, towards the end of the Luminosity SK era and going into the Astralis era. Even though Astralis has been so dominant the last couple of years, I would still argue there are more top teams who could have been dominating before this period, but who are right now stuck in this world where there's one team so absurdly brilliant that they don't get the chance to shine. That's the problem with a lot of these Swedish players, is they were #1 in the world. They were brilliant way too soon. The game was still in its infancy. We had very few top teams. Hell, when Get Right won most of his MVP awards, there were barely any professional teams. Sure, there was some getting money, someone getting salaries, but they were not professional in the way they are now. So, when you put in the context under which a lot of these Swedes won their events, won their majors, won their consecutive #1 player in the world rankings, that's why it's not that easy for me to say these guys are locks. If we're talking about all of Counter-Strike holistically, yeah, we probably definitely already have mentioned at least one Swede. But here they are in the maybes. Not quite there, I don't believe. Another player in there is Kenny S. Absolutely insane individual performer. Never found the consistency of team to go along with it. On the same vein, we have Snacks. Now Snacks is from the Polish scene. Many people would argue there should be a Polish player somewhere up here, but if we look at the last 5 years, ever since Virtus.pro won Katowice, their only major, it's been maybe Virtus.pro. They'd come in, they'd win one tournament out of nowhere, but then we wouldn't hear about them. They'd almost get relegated from the Pro League. They'd occasionally have flashes at LANs, but the Polish scene has been pretty dead for the last minimum 4 years. I'm going to shout out a couple in-game leaders. So firstly, Fallen. Fallen as an in-game leader has won a lot of tournaments, but also has 4 MVP medals to go with it. So he has individually been leading his team as a player, not just as the tactician, the mind, the general. He's won a shit ton of tournaments, we know this. Differently yet similar, Carrigan. Carrigan as an in-game leader is very different to Fallen, obviously. He has won MVP from 2014, and that was an absurd anomaly. If you check the stats, his team won the event. He was the #1 performing player on his team, but he was 15th on the overall ranking or something silly like that for that tournament. It's quite an outlier. But what impresses me about Carrigan, and what should impress you, is that he has taken 3 completely different rosters from some of them middling, some of them, were already considered good, but he's taken 3 different rosters to the top. Took the Dignitas that then went into TSM, that was then TQM to Astralis before he got kicked to the top, won a bunch of tournaments with them, went on to FaZe. He built the first real international super team in FaZe and had success. Sure, there were the G2 roster that came before it and the first iteration of FaZe, but they were, scrappy, puggy team. He made them a real team and won a bunch of tournaments with them. Had one of the most dominant tournament runs in ESL1 New York, I think 2017, where they had one map where they lost double-digit rounds the entire tournament. It was absurd to watch. And then he went on to Mouse Sports and took them from, the downhill and turned it back around. They were looking down. Now, we know it was a solid team with good players, but he turned their fortunes around again. Now, lastly, it'd feel wrong to not mention all the other Astralis players just as a cluster, almost. Glaive, of course, getting the most credit out of all of them because of his little spark that he added to that roster, that core that couldn't win the majors, it couldn't win the biggest tournaments. He came in and they've now won 4 majors with him. So from that angle, it's quite hard for me to not put Glaive onto my Mount Rushmore as my number 4 player. He truly has been a godsend for the Danish team. It's a toss-up. It's hard for me. I have so much respect for Carrigan, but it's hard to argue with Glaive's success. There's taking 3 different rosters to the top, and then there's taking one roster and being so dominant that people were calling this era weak just because of how great Astralis were. Just because I have so much personal respect for him, I'm going to put Karrigan as my last member of my Mount Rushmore of Counter-Strike. But this is all subject to change, obviously. So, Karrigan is on my Mount Rushmore. Feel free to leave a comment. Tell me what your Mount Rushmore is, or your top 4 greatest players. Feel free to disagree with me. That's okay. Alright, bye-bye.